And CERRE is an independent academic think tank dedicated to improving regulation in key sectors like energy, tech, media, and mobility. CERRE brings together academics, regulators, industry experts, and civil society to deliver evidence-based research and foster informed debates that shape effective EU policies. Today, we turn our focus to the single ticketing regulation, a pivotal initiative aimed at enabling seamless multimodal ticketing across Europe. This regulation seeks to simplify ticket purchases for combined journeys through better interoperability, tackling technical, economic, legal hurdles to integrate mobility. It is expected to be published in the next quarter, but we don't have any preview version yet of this text. To kick things off, we will have a presentation by two of our academics who have started a research on the topic, Professor Carlo Cambini and Professor Paolo Beria. Professor Paolo Cambini comes from Politecnico Torino. Professor Beria comes from Polytechnic Milano. And they will deliver a short presentation sharing the key insights of the first part of their research and the implications for European regulation, as well as the economic behind this regulation. We will then follow this presentation by approximately 40 minutes of discussion, during which we will invite you to submit discussions, comments via the chat, and then we will try to weave your questions that you may have. Please use the chat to ask your questions. We will weave your questions in the chat throughout the conversation that I'll have with our distinguished speakers. So I will now give the floor to Paolo Beria and Carlo Cambini to get us started.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to make a very short presentation just to introduce the topics to the audience. If you go ahead with the slides, we know that the European Commission has introduced a very long process of consultation related to 3 issues with the goal to reinforce railway passenger rights and also enhance market competition. We have 3 pillars of this big reform that is on the way, basically. The first one is the passenger mobility rights that focus mostly on the individual rights in order to avoid the possible problem of discrimination and to guarantee appropriate assistance, or more related to customer-based relationship. The second pillar is the multimodal digital mobility service. So the idea is to introduce multimodality in ticketing. So the idea is develop the ticketing that incorporate more than one mode of transport, to introduce the ticketing market that we were going to discuss in a while. The last one is the single digital booking and ticketing regulation, which is especially specifically focused on the railways tickets, with the idea to expand the availability and diversity of tickets and fares on also digital platforms, so giving the opportunity to users basically to use also alternative way of buying their ticketing in the economic landscape. Of course, including not only the digital platform, but also incumbents and the new operators' platforms. So go ahead with the slides. What is the topic that we want to discuss? We discussed we are going to discuss in our note. So we know that the rail regulation, the rail sector basically started as a vertical integrated industries, and this is also what happens also to the ticketing sector. So typically this is heavily integrated within the supply side, the supply chain of incumbent transport incumbent operators. Of course, we know that the data show that the digital platforms has been largely increased over the time, and indeed what happened is that many incumbents has developed their own platforms in order to provide digital services and digital ticketing to their users. No, let's remain to the previous one. Thank you. The market has been expanded in several industries like Sweden, Italy, and many others, thanks to the entry in the market of new open access operators. In this case, most of those railways operators created their own digital platform for selling their tickets. And so now we have a multiple platforms that basically compete in this perspective. At the same time, what we notice is that there are, apart very few exceptions, there is no obligation for allowing third parties to enter the market, and therefore to have just some sort of reciprocal agreements between operators. So basically new entrants in the markets, those small operators or other aggregators of data in the market, the digital platform here, do not have access to consolidated sales channels. And therefore here the regulation that comes into place is the regulation that have the scope to allow other operators to enter the market, either focused on the ticketing market and or also in the transport plus ticketing markets. Here, the idea of the newcomers is simply that, especially for a small transport operator, for example, will be extremely costly to introduce their own platforms, sales platforms within their systems, and therefore the regulation have the scope to introduce, to help them to use existing platform for their initiatives. Now, what is the main problem here is that the European Commission is going to introduce a new regulation. The new regulation is still not well known. We don't know what are the contents of this new introduction of the new rules that the European Commission is going to introduce. But what we should keep into account is that the regulation of ticketing platform should be designed, of course, to support the goal of regulation, which is increased market competition, but at the same time, it should avoid to create further market failures or new forms of market failures within the market. Here, the point that we would like to raise, and we would like to ask to our speakers later, is that if one size, in terms of regulation, one size does not fit all, probably rules should change according to different countries, according to the characteristics of the degree of competition that we face in that specific countries. For example, we have in Europe countries where the competition, the incumbents are super strong, and in that case, probably allowing them to sell tickets also of rival firms may generate a sort of leveraging effect, expanding the dominant position from the transport modes on the ticketing modes. In other countries, you have more than one operators competing to each other, and therefore, at least in some segment, and therefore probably regulation might be somehow, I'm not saying lifted, but lighter with respect to the standard one. Another issue which is important for us is that in this new regulation, also output-based measure could be relevant. Discussing what we have in mind here is a problem of punctuality, but for example, also problem of liability. We have multiple tickets, several operators which is providing the service, but of course the idea is that each transport operator should keep the liability on the service that they provide and not extend their liability to other services. Another issue that is important here in terms of the regulatory framework is to try to understand the role of the national regulatory authorities here. So which role they have, what they need to how they can intervene within, of course, the regulatory framework, but still there might be scope for some tailor-made specific intervention that, again, as we said at the beginning, may depend on the characteristic of the market that they know quite well in their country, and of course may change country to country. Now, if you move to the second topics, we have a problem of regulating the ticket platform, and for regulating the ticket platform, a second topic which is extremely important here is data sharing. Data sharing and so data pricing in some sense. We know that data sharing is one of the fundamental enabler for having efficiency and introducing competition within the framework. So, of course, one of the key regulatory interventions should be to enable data sharing within the market. Data sharing, of course, impose some sort of interoperability between the different ticketing service and reservation system across different operators, and also information that should be important to allow all operators, both physical and digital, to sell tickets within the railways industries. So to have a different possibility to introduce pricing schemes. Now the problem comes from the regulatory perspective is how data sharing can be implemented. Of course, some obligation to introduce data sharing, but at the same time there might be some technical issue to take into account. For example, there is an issue of security, so how the data can be shared among different operators in a secure way. And then maybe also which kind of data should be shared. For example, probably some data might be less relevant, and apart from the schedules, fares, seat availability, and so on, other possible information might not be necessarily shared. And then, of course, there is a problem of from the economic perspective that we would like to raise here. How to price those data. This is a big issue that in the data space is it's been debated quite a lot for a lot of time in different contexts. Here, for example, we might be inspired, for example, for the European Data Act that introduced the concept of FRAND, fair and reasonable access and non-discriminatory method. So the idea is to price the data in a way that is fair and does not create discrimination among operators. The concept of FRAND from the economic perspective has been studied quite a lot of time ago, starting from the patenting and innovation studies. But at the same time, the problem was that there was no real consensus on how to implement the FRAND methodology. It might be implemented, for example, introducing input-oriented data pricing, so pricing which is based on the number of data that have been shared among operators, or an output-based pricing mechanism, so based on the revenues generated by those data from additional platforms. What is important is that the FRAND concept per se, if you go to the literature on innovation, has generated a lot of legal disputes. And so the point is to try to understand the effect of those mechanisms within the framework we are discussing here. Now let's go to the next slide. So here we have some questions, but in reality are questions that we might also ask to our speakers later, so experts in the industries. We know that opening and regulating the platforms, especially for ticketing, is necessary to increase competition into the market. But at the same time, as we said before, the idea is to try to preserve and to generate competition in the market without creating the dominant position in the ticketing market. So we need to introduce regulation to avoid the dominant position, but at the same time try to eliminate potential additional market failures that the regulation may generate. So the point is to have in mind the market power, what is the concept of fair prices here, and so the problem of data sharing, how data sharing could be implemented. As we mentioned before, one issue which is important to us is in a very general framework, fair prices means FRAND, how FRAND can be used and can be introduced into the system in a regulatory way, either set by the regulator or through bilateral commercial negotiation between players in the market. And finally, the last issue that we would like to discuss with our guest is the so-called space for asymmetric regulation or graduated regulation, let's say in this way. So the idea is that we might have different rules in different countries and different rules for different operators according to, for example, temporal obligations. So, for example, some operators might be obliged to introduce single ticketing from the very beginning or later on. We might have obligation for some specific sector services, for example, I don't know, introducing the obligation to single ticketing, for example, if are included PSO services into the ticketing, or other kind of different approach to regulation. So those are very quickly what we have in mind and what we are going to discuss and what we would like to discuss with our guest here. Thank you so much. Enguerrand, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlo, for this nice presentation and the state of play. I'd like now to invite you all to ask questions if you have questions, either for our two presenters or for our panelists that I will introduce in a minute. Do not hesitate to send any questions in the chat. We have a very nice panel today, which is formed first by Fabien Yao, who is working at the Authority for Regulation of Transport in France. He's an economist at the ART. We also have Nicoletta Mortanella, who is head of legal affairs and compliance at Italo, a train operator in Italy. We also have today with us Chiara Tomasi, who is head of Brussels government affairs at Trainline, so a ticketing operator. So we have the chance to have different views. I'd like also to remind everyone who is in the audience that this webinar is also live streamed on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Zoom, but it will be available afterwards on the YouTube channel if you want to reaccess some of our discussions at a later stage. One of the first questions that I like to ask, and maybe I'll give first Nicoletta the floor, and is to see whether you agree with this state of play, or if you think that there are issues that should be raised that have not been raised yet. Then I'll give the floor to Chiara and then to Fabien. I'll try to ask to keep your opening statement rather short. Let's say 3 minutes or so, maybe 4, but no more. Thank you. Nicoletta, the floor is yours.
Good morning to everybody, and thank you very much for this opportunity. It is a real pleasure to discuss with you one of the most significant topic in order to develop a really integrated European mobility system, which is the concept of single ticketing. Of course, this is a chance in order to create a seamless travel experience for passengers across multiple operators. But we have to consider, in our opinion and for our point of view, 4 key points. The first one is related to pricing. With reference to pricing, we have to keep for sure the full freedom to set, each operator should keep the freedom to set its own fares, because imposed or standardized pricing would for sure undermine competitiveness and economic sustainability. So platforms should act as mere aggregators without interfering with operators' commercial policies. Second key point is related to liability, which must for sure clearly defined, because each single operator should be responsible for its own leg of journey, its own segment of journey. Joint and several liability would create legal and financial risks for carriers, and so a clear and harmonized framework for reimbursement, for instance, indemnification and reprotection, is essential in order to grant, on one side, passengers' rights, but on the others, ensure also fairness for operators indirectly affected from any kind of disruption. Third key point is the technological and economic sustainability, because for sure single ticketing must be an opportunity and not a barrier for market growth. So while technological evolution is necessary to enable coordination and integration, it must not impose financial burdens on operators. So solution should be, as also Professor Cambini was saying, should be scalable and interoperable, and EU should support investments, particularly for private operators active on the market. Final point, which was already underlined by Professor Cambini, is data sharing, which is for sure an enabler of competition, but it is critical because the European goal is very clear: interoperability and continuity of travel. But to achieve this, operator and also ticketing platforms should exchange real-time static and dynamic data, and we have to understand which data we have to share, because no problems with delays, disruptions, train schedules, and platforms, but there are many data which represent, which are confidential and represent an industrial secret for the company. So to share data would for sure allow passengers to receive accurate and multilingual information before, during, and after the journey, and we need a common interface to share operational data, but we have to avoid distortion of competition. We have to avoid any market failure due to the fact that commercial strategies of each carrier could be somehow jeopardized. And so the sharing of data should be regulated under a voluntary agreement between operators within an EU framework in order to fully protect the commercial assets of each operator. So we think that these key pillars, these 4 key pillars, are crucial in order to make single market ticketing a real success and a real opportunity, because addressing these points with pragmatism and vision could consent to build a system that is technologically advanced, economically viable, and legally sound.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta. I'd like now to give the floor to Chiara.
Yes, hi everyone.
So my question is the same for you. How do you find the state of play as described by Carlo and Paolo? Do you agree, or are there things that you think should be put forward further?
I think they have a very good overview, and I was noting down as they were going into the presentation. I think the first point I want to stress, it's in the title, but I think it's good to keep an eye on it. This is really about economics. So certainly the tech aspect of it is important, but mostly, for the most part, the tech is there, the platforms are there, the willingness to offer rail and multimodal tickets is there. A lot of platforms like Trainline have emerged, and the carriers themselves are doing more and more in terms of putting tickets together and selling each other. So there's definitely a lot that's moving. The issue that, at least from our perspective, the sector still faces is more economic. It's about the commercial conditions that regulate the relationships between the different players in this sector. And for an independent ticket vendor like Trainline, the biggest obstacle we face at the moment in Europe is the difficulty in getting fair market conditions and fair negotiations with the operators on the rail side, especially the ones that are big enough in a country that they generally can dictate any commercial and contractual conditions that they want. And that makes it really difficult for us to operate, to invest, to earn enough money to build new services, to cover new countries. So really for us, it's not as much of a technical issue as it is a market failure, as Carlo was mentioning at the start. The good news here, at least from our perspective, is that the EU has seen this as an issue and plans to intervene with the ticketing reform that Carlo was mentioning. In particular, the SDBTR bit of this package should do wonders in just making sure that these negotiations between parties happen on a level playing field. So what the law, as far as we understand, would aim to do is just make sure that a dominant rail operator cannot abuse their market power when they deal with other ticketing platforms, and should hopefully give national regulators some space to intervene in dispute resolutions. And this relatively simple, very targeted intervention would really do wonders for the issues we're facing at the moment in the market. Once that level playing field is set, then we go back to negotiating with each other and let the best negotiator win. But without that support, we cannot make really strides in terms of innovating and growing in the European market. The other point that I noted down and that was mentioned a couple of times was the risk of creating market failures. We actually think there is a potential for this to happen with a part of the proposal that we understand the EU is considering, and that's the MDMS bit. I see somebody in the questions raised this as well. The idea to force the dominant rail operators to sell tickets from their competitors. We are a bit concerned that this will be where some of the market failures might emerge. Rail operators' platforms tend to be the dominant ticketing platforms. So by forcing them to sell smaller carriers in their countries, you are making them even more dominant potentially, and that could risk undermining all the benefits that we hope SDBTR will achieve on the other side. So we see definitely space for some targeted interventions, but definitely focusing on first advancing the ability of everyone to compete on a fair basis, and then potentially at a later stage, if market failures persist, going in a little bit deeper.
Thank you very much, Chiara. I don't know to give the floor to Fabien, and I'll ask him the same question. Fabien Yao is an economist at the Authority for the Regulation of the Transportation in France. Fabien, I'd like you to also give your views on the state of play as presented by Carlo and Paolo, and maybe identify also the market failures that you see in your national market.
Thank you, Enguerrand, and thanks to the CERRE for having us here. So yes, actually, I'm completely in line with what has been identified by Professor Cambini and also panelists by saying that currently here in France, the national incumbent has a dominant position in the rail operation side, but also is still significantly dominant also on the distribution side. So keeping in mind that today in France, especially distribution mainly occur through digital platforms. So approximately 90% of distribution is digital. So there is definitely an issue to address here. However, in France, we currently already have a legal framework, but it actually face I would say three main weaknesses. So on the first hand, we have to bear in mind that this framework has been introduced as a way for the regulator to promote the development of multimodal digital mobility services. However, it's mainly limited to regional services and services on the public service obligation. So through this limitation, it does not fully meet its objective to foster the opening of open access by new entrants, because as I said earlier, there is still this dominant position of the incumbent, so he has the power to foreclose entry of the new entrant potentially. And also there is another limitation of the current framework, and I think that it touches with what has already been identified by other panelists. So this framework provides that operators have the obligation to open the inventory and they offer to multimodal digital mobility services under fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory condition. However, it does not clearly define what is these fair and non-discriminatory condition. So this also undermines the potential of development of these platforms because on the first hand, it delays, I would say, the conclusion of contracts between them and the operators because each party has a different vision of what friend conditions are, and on the other hand, it calls for the regulator. So, for example, ART, to provide his insight on the interpretation of the law. So these are the two main limitation that we currently have in France, but generally we can say that on the open access side, we still have an incumbent with a largely dominant position on the operation. He also significantly dominant on the distribution, but the current legal framework in place only partially covers this open access. So we are still left with the same problems that have been identified by the others.
Thank you very much, Fabien. I see that we have a series of questions coming in. Some have been partially answered by some of our panelists. Thank you very much for directly tying them in. I think we have heard everyone on market failures and perspective on that, but maybe not Nicoletta. So I'd like you maybe to explain if you see a specific market failure that you'd like to see addressed. You mentioned already some of the issues that you'd like to see addressed, but maybe not in the form of a current market failure. So this would be my first question for you, Nicoletta, and maybe could you also tell us how do you see the fact that the EU intervenes in order to regulate? Do you think that it is absolutely necessary, or would you rather have a national intervention or have simply current instruments being applied rather than having a new instrument coming in?
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor. So the first point, also listening to very interesting interventions of the other panelists, I would like to underline that in my opinion, it is worth noting that there are specific cases of operators which are neither dominant in the rail market nor in the distribution market, like Italo, for instance, which is a private operator, not dominant in any of the two specific markets, and therefore it is important in regulating the single ticketing to ensure that these kind of operators do not remain squeezed between the dominant railway operators and very powerful distribution platforms, which if we do not have a very non-discriminatory and reasonable approach, as Professor Cambini was suggesting through the friend methodology, we risk to shift the dominant position from the downstream of the market to the platforms. So it is absolutely crucial to have a very, very reasonable and non-discriminatory environment and a regulation which is really pro-competitive and that has in mind that we have to foster development of competition and a seamless experience for the passenger, because otherwise if we squeeze all the new entrants or the operators which are not dominant in any market between these two dominant operators, railway operators and platforms, for sure we have a market failure. We will determine a market failure.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta. Maybe you want to add something on the fact that the EU intervenes rather than an intervention at the national level?
Yes, in my opinion, EU intervention is needed in this case, together, of course, with a very careful overview of the competent authorities of any member states, because this is a supranational, topic, because we are trying to develop a European mobility system which is really integrated and intermodal. And in order to have it, for sure, it has to be cross-border. So considering that many countries are involved, many member states are involved, we need an EU intervention.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta. So I think we all addressed the question from SNCF group on the market failures. I'd like now to hear maybe Chiara on the fact that the EU would intervene and that we would adopt an instrument at the EU level. Is the measure absolutely necessary at the EU level, or would you just rather see enforcement of current existing legislations? I see in some in the chat that some are asking about GDPR, DGA, Data Governance Act, DMA, and others. What do you think of this?
I would say there is no current legislation that, even if enforced better, would fix some of these issues. So certainly some of the interoperability or data sharing questions are addressed. For example, data sharing is addressed in the rail passenger rights framework that already exists. But the issue of the difficult relationships between dominant carriers, non-dominant carriers, and platforms, which are sometimes carriers themselves, is really not covered by any legislation. I saw the DMA being mentioned. In principle, maybe some of the banned practices in the DMA would apply, but none of the actual problematic operators or platforms would actually fit in the description of what a gatekeeper is in the DMA. And all of the data sharing legislation would not cover the financial aspect of these negotiations and these contractual relationships. Again, maybe interesting to take a minute to clarify, but platforms like Trainline generally remunerate themselves by negotiating a percentage with the carriers for each ticket they sell. That's not something that is covered by data sharing practices. That is really just a commercial feature. And there is no legislation at the moment that addresses that type of relationship, except for a few examples at national and regional level, like the one Mr. Yao was mentioning in France, which introduces FRAND principles for specifically these cases. But as himself mentioned, the law doesn't actually define what FRAND is, and that's why we would say we would think it's necessary to take this good example and expand it. Whether it's at national or European level, I would say depends on whichever comes first and faster. But obviously, the European level is the one that guarantees the most uniform and cross-border approach. So generally speaking, it's always preferable.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Then I turn to Fabien. The French legislation has been mentioned, so maybe you want to say something. Why do you think that French legislation would not be enough, or would be enough and would not require additional EU intervention?
All right. Thank you, Enguerrand. So yes, as I mentioned previously, here the French legislation does not clearly provide a definition of what French conditions are actually. So actually, we would like to have a bit of clarification here. So I agree that this clarification may come nationally, but as Chiara mentioned, I think that it will be more appropriate to have it at the EU level, so that we can avoid divergence in interpretation, and so that the legal framework is applied in an homogeneous way in all member states. And when it comes to the French legislation per se, so currently, as I mentioned previously, it does not actually address the whole market of the railway sector, for instance, because it's mainly focusing on regional and services on the PSO. However, open access operation is still a significant component of passengers journey. And as Nicoletta mentioned, actually we would like open entrance and other operators that are not in a dominant position in either side of the distribution or the operation to actually address the market. And for them to address the market, it will be appropriate for them to be distributed on the platform that are significantly dominant. But here in France, for instance, the platform of the national incumbents does not currently distribute the ticket of new entrants like Trainline.
Thank you very much. So we have examined a series of questions, the state of play and the need for intervention so far. I'd like to now turn a bit on the modalities of this intervention, and we have heard different issues. We have heard discussions about FRAND. We have heard discussions about liability. There is also some questions in the chat with regards to the experience from the side of the passengers, if we have specific liability regimes. And so I'd like to first maybe start with the question of liability regime for this kind of single ticketing. And so my question, so Nicoletta already expressed her opinion that the liability should be really segmented, so to say. So I might skip you here, but I will give you the floor afterwards as a reaction, Nicoletta. But maybe Chiara, you have something to say. I'll ask Fabien the same question, and then I'll come back to you, Nicoletta. Chiara.
On passenger rights attached to tickets, you mean? Yes. I think on this, operators are best placed to discuss what framework would work for them and what's the best way to split liability in a way that's transparent and allows them to deal with each other in these situations. What we would say from our perspective, being sometimes the interface between them and the customer and the people who are actually on their trains, is that at the very least we see space to find a better solution to the problem of journey continuation. So when you do have travel that includes different operators, you're not always sure about what's going to happen if you miss your connection. And in that case, we see operators themselves have been working quite a bit to try and make that scenario easier to handle. They have agreements with each other that should allow the passenger to know more or less what train they can board next and what to do with their tickets. We think this could be taken on board and expanded, including some of the smaller carriers that at the moment are not in the bigger carriers agreement. But in any case, we see quite a lot of space there where all of us can work together to make sure that at the very least, a passenger that is experiencing disruption knows what's their next step is and how they can get to the destination, which is ultimately what most people want to achieve when something wrong happens with their travel.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Fabien, do you want to add something on this?
Yeah, I think that the main of the topic has been addressed by Chiara already. But yes, I think that as current operators have already in a way find some solutions to foster seamless journey continuation for passengers. So I'm thinking about agreement on journey continuation, or maybe hot nuts, so hop on the next available train. So maybe a possibility would be to generalize these type of framework, and I'm also thinking of the context which is currently in place in the UK, where there is some kind of chamber of compensation, so that if a passenger takes a train which is different from that of the initial carrier, in the end the carrier who actually accommodated the passenger may receive the corresponding receipt for that journey. So I think that yes, generalizing the agreement on journey continuation and maybe coming up with some kind of chamber of compensation would help to balance liabilities between carriers.
Thank you very much, Fabien. Maybe a last word on this, Nicoletta?
Yes, for sure. I agree both with Chiara and Fabien. There should be strict cooperation among all operators and carriers, all stakeholders involved in the journey in order to grant journey continuation to the passenger. But the principle, our North Star, I would say, should be a segmented liability. A joint and several liability doesn't work, and the passenger has to know that once he buys one single ticketing and there is a disruption occurs, then he or she has to go directly to the operator which had the disruption, which caused to whom the delay is attributable, in order to have indemnification, in order to have reimbursement of the ticket. And then as far as reprotection is concerned, for sure there will be as much cooperation as possible among all the stakeholders involved.
Thank you very much for your interesting insights. I have a few questions on the funding of the data sharing and maybe going beyond just data pricing. I've got in the questions Ferdinand Birkenstein from firstfare.io who is wondering, if I understand correctly his questions, to what extent should public funding be expected to support the system? To what extent should the operator start creating an independent broker in order to support maybe not the data sharing, but maybe the operation of the ticket resale? What do you think about the structure in terms of funding that should be created in the future? Maybe I'll hear first Fabien as the first respondent.
Thank you, Enguerrand. But actually, I do not have a clear proposition of whether public funding should be involved in this data sharing process. But I definitely think that this is something to be considered as an option. But I do not have a predetermined view on whether this is viable or not.
Maybe Nicoletta, you want to say something on this?
I don't have a clear picture either. In my opinion, we have to understand which path we have to follow. Either private funding, and so in this case, each operator will invest its own funds, of course, or otherwise public funding, which should be transparent, of course, and non-discriminatory as well, because otherwise we create distortion to the market. So we have to be very careful in terms of public funding.
And Chiara, maybe you have something to say on public funding and the creation of independent brokers by local or by national operators.
So I'm not sure exactly what we mean with independent brokers, but I think MMTIS mentioned in the questions. There have been attempts to sort of take the data out of the operators and put them in a centralized place from which then all the players who want to sell those tickets and get the data can just take it and use it. That is not how the system has worked in Europe at the moment. We all sort of independently and bilaterally share data with each other. So I don't know how public funding would apply to such a sort of bilateral and contractually driven system. So on this one, I'm afraid it's going to have to be for the operators and the public authorities to figure out.
Thank you very much. I think there was I saw questions which was interlinking urban mobility with rail proposals. How do you see actually the interlinking of what is in the pipeline, which is mostly rail focused, with other instruments? Some also talks about distribution of flights online. And so, or urban mobility or shared mobility, how do you see single ticketing fitting in the bigger picture? Maybe Chiara, you have something to say on this. I see you nodding.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. And one of the answers I have to this is that if independent platforms can finance themselves and should survive, one of the things they will invest in most likely is door-to-door, because it's one of the things that people are demanding. So going back to that point about the fact that it's all about the economics, this is also part of why the economics are important, because if the independent platforms can earn a decent wage working in this field, then they will most likely take some of that money and invest it in services like this. The same could be said for the operators, obviously, if they see an interest in it. But at the moment, what we've seen is that it's a lot of the independent platforms who are experimenting with air plus rail and bus plus rail, as is the case of Trainline, and door-to-door and urban mobility. So that's where I think you'll be likely to see some of that development, provided that the platforms on the independent side can survive and grow.
Thank you very much. Maybe Fabien or Nicoletta, you want something to add something? Fabien, I see you.
Yes, actually, I completely agree with Chiara when she said that the financial aspect of the frame condition is definitely what will mainly drive the independent MDMS to enter the market, because of from my view here in France, in the transport regulatory body, we are currently settling the dispute, and actually this remuneration aspect is a key issue for some actors who are actually selling long distance or open access rail tickets, and who also are active in urban mobility in some cities. So yeah, I think that remuneration might maybe ease their way in the market, provided that we clearly know what frame conditions are.
Nicoletta, maybe a last word on this?
Yes, in my opinion, I agree with Chiara and Fabian. Single ticketing platforms should integrate as many operators as possible in order to render the experience, truly effective. But for sure, the financial aspect is, and the remuneration aspect, of course, is relevant. So we have to understand how negotiations can be dealt with among the operators. If also urban operators could be integrated within the platforms, of course, I guess it could be a win-win for everybody, because for the passenger at first.
Yes, thank you very much, Nicoletta. I see that we have many more questions actually that are still unanswered, but for the sake of timing, there is a question that comes back a few times, and I like you to give maybe a final word to each of you before giving maybe the time for a short conclusion to Paolo. So we see that not everyone is convinced by the fact that there is a market failure just because there are some dominant actors. Maybe some of you would like to respond to that and to explain really where do they identify the market failure in itself, and why we need actually this instrument as a short recap of what we have discussed so far. Maybe Chiara, I will give you the floor.
Yes, I think there is definitely a market failure, and it's pretty clear to see in countries where one rail operator is dominant. There is much less space for innovative players to come into the market, both on the distribution side and on the rail side. There is less competition, and I think this audience knows that less competition generally means worse service, higher prices, less offer, and less diversity. university, I can point, and I'm very happy to be able to do that to my own country of Italy, where competition in rail has actually sparked quite an improvement on every dimension. And I'm glad Nicoletta is here, because Italy is one of the best success stories, I think, in rail competition in Europe. But since they've entered the market, prices are lower, there are more passengers, the service has improved. The flight routes on the routes that the Trenitalia and Italo cover are almost by now effectively replaced by rail. So a lot of positive externalities have come from opening to competition. So I think it goes without saying that the more competition, the better, especially when that competition happens under FRAND terms, which protect all sides involved and prevent any platform, any operator from emerging and becoming yet another dominant player on the other side. So it's really a win-win.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Nicoletta, probably you agree with most of what Chiara said, but maybe you want to add some nuance.
100%, I would say. Competition is always the best solution, but in order to have a real, genuine competition, of course, we need safe regulation in order to avoid any kind of distortion of the market, which then could create market failure. I think that single ticketing will succeed only if it stays fair for all, keeps pricing free, and remains light on regulation and on operators.
Thank you very much for Nicoletta. Fabien, a very last word on this.
Yes. So a very last word. Yeah, I completely agree with the Italian side, I would say, and I would simply add that when we mention asymmetric regulation to tackle this specific market failure, I don't see that as a purely necessary thing. I would rather see it as a contextual thing, meaning that it is because today we have incumbents, especially in France, which is in dominant position both on distribution and operation, as we mentioned, and as a consequence, he has the ability to foreclose market entry on both new entrant operators and also on digital MDMS. But provided that there is no longer risk of market entry or foreclosure, so maybe in that case, in the end, maybe there would not be such a big need for asymmetric regulation. So I think that we should also always put things in context. So that's it.
Thank you very much to Chiara, Nicoletta, and Fabien for joining this discussion. Carlo and Paolo remained quite silent, hearing the different perspectives. I'll give now 3 minutes, 2 minutes and a half to Paolo, maybe to summarize the discussions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It was very interesting and fruitful and stimulating discussion. So I took a lot of notes. I would have a lot of comments too, but not much time. So I would like to start quickly from the question that has been repeated many times and replied many times. Where is the market failure? Do we need regulation for which market failure? Well, it's always important to underline an obvious thing. The first market failure is in the rail market. And so this regulation and the promotion and the stimulation of distribution in the distribution market is there mainly to solve or help to solve that market failure. So one market failure exists for sure. The point is that the regulation on ticketing should not create other market failures in the second level market, which is ticketing and distribution. Second comment, again on this topic, isn't antitrust regulation enough? No, probably no, because the idea of regulation is also to stimulate, to avoid problems, but also to stimulate better market assets and not just correct problems, issues, disputes. So the role for ex-ante regulation is much more proactive than antitrust regulation. So the idea is to have markets which are working better from the economic point of view and not just be legally correct. Third comment, I think that the comments of the audience, of our panelists, underlined quite well, even with the examples brought, that we are not in the classical case of big incumbent with market power and small new entrants with no market power at all. The easy regulation is never easy, but the easy case is big versus small. We have here a clear example when this is not the case. First, because sometimes the small ones are not so small, but at the same time, they are small, they are weak in some aspects of the market, in some parts of the market. So the situation is much more blurred. And it's not big and small, but we have a wide range of cases that should be considered in the regulation. And this makes difficult the job, but also very stimulating at them. I think we are running out of time, so just very quick notes. Pricing, you already said something about pricing, about the front principles. Probably the best way in this case is to leave everything to the market because of this different graduation of power of the different players. So probably a mix of some central regulation is needed, but at the same time would be wise to keep a mix of voluntary and compulsory regulations. Not to, if everything is compulsory, the commercial freedom of the players is reduced. So probably a mix of the two would be wise. And about local versus EU regulation, this is clearly, as said, a global or a continental market. So EU homogeneous regulation is needed and wanted. At the same time, some specificities could remain local, national, but also some aspects could be left to the local, to the national dimension. For example, data sharing, data collection, the transfer of data, of some data to the policymaker, which is another actor not sitting at this virtual table, but probably also equally interested to the topic. And I think that's it from my side. I hope that we will go on in working on this topic and have feedbacks, meet you again at the next event in January, probably with more inputs from our side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo, Carlo, and all our discussants for this engaging discussion on the single ticket regulation and the economic aspects of it. Your questions in the chat really added some depth to our exchange and some critical perspectives. I'd say this conversation only marks the beginning of our process. We will soon have a draft research paper on the topic on the economics of the ticketing of the single regulation. And we are really trying to capture today's insight and further analysis. To build on this momentum, we are organizing an internal private workshop in mid-January to dive deeper into implementation challenges, additional aspects that we haven't covered, such as the side effects of the regulation that we haven't gone into depth today, unfortunately. But we are really looking towards your perspective for implementation challenges and policy recommendations. You're all welcome to join this internal process. Please reach out to us if you'd like to be involved in the next steps. Thanks you once again to everyone who joined us today, who shared questions. We look forward to your continued involvement into shaping smarter mobility regulation in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.